Good morning, and welcome to Nuclear for a Net Zero Century. First, let me give special thanks to the hosts for today's event, including UK Energy, the UK Nuclear Industries Association, and UK Renewables. My name is Carol Berrigan. I'm an executive director with the Nuclear Energy Institute in Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to facilitate today's discussion. Let me introduce our wonderful guests who will bring their perspectives to this very important issue. First, let me introduce John Gorman. John is the President and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Association. John brings a long background in renewable energy to the conversation around nuclear. Also, let me introduce Tom Greatrex. He is the CEO of the UK Nuclear Industry Association and has been there for quite some time and brings a lot of expertise in nuclear. And Lisa McBride. Lisa is both the president of Women in Nuclear Canada and also the country leader for GE Hitachi's small modular reactor in Canada. Welcome this morning to this conversation. You've probably heard a lot during the COP conversation around the need to decarbonize our economies. A lot of focus has been put on near-term decarbonization in the electric power sector. But today's conversation will be a bit broader. We're going to talk about how nuclear energy can be part of a solution for broader decarbonization of other sectors of our economies that are beyond electric power. Let me start with a question for John. John, when you think about the electricity grid and nuclear, can you talk a little bit about some of the most exciting innovations that you're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Indeed, the nuclear space and many of the innovations that are going on in nuclear are very, very exciting and promising for our net zero future. I think when the general person in the public thinks about nuclear energy, they think about these very large conventional plants that indeed have been very important over the last 50, 60 years in the sense that they provide 10% of the world's clean electricity, or electricity period, second only to hydro. They've been responsible for cleaning up entire economies and phasing out coal-fired generation in important places, right, and doing it in record time. And that clean electricity in those large amounts is going to continue to be, very important as we try to switch away from fossil fuels to fuel switch and electrify different parts of our economy. But on the basis of this long history in nuclear electricity, conventional nuclear, there's a lot of innovation being done. And in particular, I think we're going to be speaking quite a bit about advanced nuclear or small modular reactors, as we call them. So these new reactors, these small modular reactors, are very scalable. They produce clean electricity. They're very responsive and very flexible, so they can ramp up and down very quickly, which is great for things like partnering them with intermittent sources of renewables like wind and solar. But I think the most interesting and promising thing about these small modular reactors, Carol, is they're really high temperature heat machines, right? Very high temperature, more so, much more so actually than the conventional nuclear. And what that means is that, sure, you can take that high temperature heat and you can produce electricity, generate steam, turn some turbines. But you can also use that high temperature heat to do other things that I'm sure we're going to discuss, whether it's produce hydrogen, desalinate water, or most promising for industrialized countries is using that high temperature heat to replace the fossil fuels that are used in really hard to decarbonize places, like the creation of cement and steel, bringing the small modular reactors into mining operations to not only provide the heat, but the power and even produce hydrogen, right, using either its heat or its electricity. And all sorts of other very important things for creating a just society in the future. I think we'll probably talk later about how these things can be used in developing economies and things like that. So the takeaway from all this is these new innovations in nuclear, the small modular reactors, very scalable, very responsive, but high temperature heat machines. So I think that's going to be a game changer.
Thanks, John. Lisa, let me turn to you. GE Hitachi is a very innovative company with a long history in nuclear. You're working now on an SMR design and looking at deploying that. Can you talk a little bit about that innovation and what that will bring to both the power market and applications beyond power?
Sure, and I mean, John certainly touched on some of the things that are happening in the industry in his remarks, so not to duplicate, but you know, historically we've seen large-scale centralized plants covering large distances with separate electricity generators and different consumers, and you know, innovation of SMRs and the deployment of SMRs will certainly bring safe, reliable, carbon-free energy closer to where it's needed, creating efficiencies and flexibility in balancing kind of the energy supply and demand, and expand, you know, really what the role of nuclear energy looks like.
Great, thank you. Tom, how do you see nuclear playing a greater role here in the UK?
Well, I think there's two challenges. The first one is the bit we always talk about, which is grid electricity, and we're not going to talk about that so much today. So the other set of challenges are the things that are hard to decarbonise, and the UK makes a lot of our record in reduction of emissions, but that has come almost completely in electricity to grid. But you know, how we decarbonise transport, how we decarbonise heating and domestic heating in the UK, 80% of it is gas. What we do with industrial processes, how we ensure that fuels for heavy transport, so maritime, aviation, all those things which are the crux of getting to 2050 and net zero. Those are the really hard things to do, and it feels to me as though we're probably at the reasonably close to the start of that conversation, being serious about how do we try to do that, and that's where I think nuclear in the UK. And more widely has a particularly important, significant role to be able to play, because those are the things where the scale of what nuclear can give you in terms of the energy density, the high temperature heat that John was just talking about with some reactor designs, all those things can help play into those harder to decarbonise sectors. And also the fact that nuclear in the UK, we've never used it flexibly because we haven't had to, because there's never been actually enough power to the grid where you would need to start to use it flexibly. But we'll get to that point. And the flexibility of nuclear, again, is something which I think plays to these wider challenges. So because of all those reasons, I think in the UK and more widely, nuclear's got a really important part to play, not just in decarbonising our electricity supply, but decarbonising more widely.
Carol, do you mind if I just build on what
Sure.
Tom and Lisa were saying for a second? Because, and especially Lisa, I think you mentioned the ability to put these small modular reactors closer to, you know, where the heat or the power is going to be needed. And I think we're going to be talking a lot, as Tom alluded to, about the source of heat that these provide. But we should also not forget the electricity too, right? I find, you know, in the Canadian context, and I'm sure in many parts of the UK and around the world, certain parts of the grid just can't take one of the conventional mega plants, right? It's just too much electricity, and the traditional model for nuclear, of course, has been, you know, build it big to get those economies of scale, and that's been a little bit prohibited in smaller regions or where there's less demand. But with these scalable small modular reactors, you can actually right size the amount of electricity that you're going to produce on the grid at that certain point. And in Canada, that's definitely playing out to be important. We're going to be able to introduce these small modular reactors into regions that just couldn't accept one of these huge plants. And the promise of small modular reactors, of course, is that you can manufacture them. And so instead of getting the economies of scale by building mega plants, you're getting the economies of scale by manufacturing either the entire thing or the major components in a mass production type way.
Okay, thanks. You know, one of the conversations we've been hearing a lot here at COP has been around hydrogen and this great transition to a hydrogen economy. But the hydrogen needs to be generated somehow. It's much like electricity in that way, that it's a means of transferring energy that can be used. Can we talk a little bit now about nuclear and hydrogen production? That's a really interesting nexus between nuclear's heat and the need for fuels like hydrogen. Tom, can I start with you on nuclear and hydrogen and how you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, again, in a UK context, the debate around hydrogen has got a lot of attention in the last few months, I'd say, and we've seen that in some of the discussions that have been having here at COP. And you know, sometimes I think when people talk about hydrogen, they just assume it just appears from somewhere. You've got to be able to produce the hydrogen if you're going to use it. And if in the UK one of the arguments is, well, you know, because of so much of our heating being reliant on gas, you know, can you use and retrofit some of that infrastructure to be able to use hydrogen as the domestic heating source as opposed to direct electrification? And you know, it's possible. There are trials and things that are going on at the moment, but there's not much point moving to using hydrogen, or not much benefit in doing that, if then the inputs into production of the hydrogen are dirty and polluting and contributing to climate change and emissions. So you need to have as your source for the hydrogen clean electricity. Basically, you can do it through electrolysis or you can do it through high temperature heat, but it needs to be through clean electricity. And there's a bit of a almost false debate that goes on about, well, that means it should just be excess electricity from offshore wind in the UK context. But actually, it's not really about that. It's about when you're thinking about trying to calibrate the more challenging and more diverse nature of that grid, how you can then use excess power at times where there is excess power, whichever source that comes from, whether that's when it's very windy or whether when it's not that windy but it's at night as opposed to day and there's excess power in demand. How can you best use that, and also then be able to use the technologies that are developing and evolving that might be primarily focused on hydrogen, and then a potential electricity capacity becomes a byproduct that is used as and when it's needed. And that's where I think in the UK context, nuclear and a lot of what's being talked about around SMR and the UK SMR consortium is looking at that. It's not necessarily thinking about grid electricity first. It's thinking about hydrogen possibly first if this takes off, and then you know you get the other benefits from that. And that's increasingly the nature of the discussion. And I think we've had in the UK a hydrogen strategy from the government. It's really starting to, I think, percolate into policymakers' minds that big chunk of what we need to do to decarbonise is going to need something else other than direct electricity. Hydrogen, it looks like a very good candidate for that. We've got to work out how do we get the hydrogen.
Okay. Lisa, let me turn to you. In a Canadian context, how do you see the hydrogen conversation playing, and where do you see nuclear fitting in there?
Well, I mean, we know nuclear is well suited to hydrogen production, and at GEH actually, you know, and Tom talked a little bit about the electrolysis and steam, but we're going to be releasing a paper very soon from GE Hitachi on this fundamentals of hydrogen production using steam electrolysis. And so one of the main conclusions of the paper is really that reactors with high temperature do not have an inherent cost benefit. It really comes down to the LCOE. And so, you know, if we think about the drivers for that, process heat is really such a small piece of the total energy required, and nuclear fuel cost, regardless of technology, really also plays into that. And so if you think of it from a capital cost perspective, you know, SMRs and nuclear is certainly an advantage in terms of hydrogen production overall. So I look forward to sharing that paper with all of you when it's published.
Thanks, Lisa. John, in Canada, how is the hydrogen conversation playing out?
Well, Canada, like many nations, thinking about Tom's comments, are heavily focused right now on creating a hydrogen economy, and I think we're still at the planning stage of it, trying to get our heads around how you actually build out the infrastructure and create the demand at the same time for hydrogen. It's challenging in the Canadian context because we've got such an enormous country with a small population, and so we're looking at creating hubs of activity where, you know, corridors or industries that are concentrated would be served by their own sort of hydrogen hub. And the Canadian federal government has launched a series of roundtables, consulting with industry about how we're going to do this. Interestingly, they've dedicated one working group, and this is kind of unusual, to the interplay between nuclear and the creation of hydrogen, because as Lisa said, there's real potential there. But with hydrogen, the issue, as Tom was saying, is that hydrogen is really an energy carrier, right? It's not an energy source in itself. You have to, some people refer to it as almost a storage medium and carrier. And so that means that you have to use energy, either heat or electricity, to create it, as Tom was saying, and that has to be clean. But I think the exciting thing about small modular reactors is the way that you're going to be able to scale the small modular reactors to be able to do multiple purposes at the same time. So it could be producing electricity while producing heat for operations or buildings, and at the same time producing hydrogen, and it could do that on a flexible, variable basis. So as Tom was saying, being responsive to whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, or freeing up capacity when it is blowing or shining, so that electricity, those green electrons, can be used to produce hydrogen, while the SMR is providing electricity, etc. So the real exciting element from my perspective is just the interplay between small modular reactors and renewables, and how the combination of those things is going to allow for hydrogen to be produced in those sort of off-pocket times.
Thanks, John. And Tom, let me turn it back to you. One of the themes that you brought up earlier and that John's been talking about a little bit is the flexibility of nuclear. And as we look at the grid of the future, how do you see nuclear playing in terms of its flexibility as we have some variable renewable resources, and that penetration is going to grow and grow in the electricity market? How do you see those coming together?
Well, I think flexibility is going to be, and it is already becoming more and more significant. And sometimes I think it's not just those who may not be favourable to nuclear that refer to nuclear as, talk about baseload and talk about being sort of inflexible. Actually, sometimes you hear people say, well, baseload's over. Baseload's not over. Baseload is a description of an amount of capacity that you're going to need. But to say that nuclear isn't flexible misunderstands the capability and the features, not just actually of small modular reactors, but also of larger reactors as well, that can operate and do load follow and can operate flexibly. So, but I think actually as a community and as an industry, we probably haven't spent enough time or done enough to be able to help people understand that. And that's something that people who think they're well informed, wouldn't naturally assume about nuclear. And as it's a feature of the system of the future, that's going to be more and more important. I think it's incumbent upon us to explain how nuclear has that feature and how that can actually aid the really much more complex task of being able to balance and use all the different clean sources we have to produce the backbone of power and other energy we're going to need for society.
One of the things I like to think about is nuclear in terms of being a firm generation source, as opposed to just simply baseload, as you said, really describes your sort of minimum requirements. But firm being there when you need it, you can turn it on when it's needed, you can use it to complement other energy sources. Lisa, let me turn to you and get your reflections on this and how nuclear fits in this grid of the future.
Right, so I mean, you certainly touched on a number of things. I think we've seen nuclear, kind of balancing, years in France. We've seen this in the U.S. and Canada, where nuclear is able to offset during seasonal increases with hydropower. So, SMRs really are going to provide that base load, and intermittent electricity where needed to offset different parts of the grid. I think, the thing about SMRs is the load following capabilities, right? So we have greater load following capabilities, more innovation in that space, and I think that's really going to help, offset some of those things that we're seeing with the grid.
Thanks. John, with your background in renewables, you had quite a career in renewables before coming into nuclear. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see renewables and nuclear working together as we go forward?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I'd love to. That's right. I'm almost new to the nuclear industry, having just joined, just over 2 years ago, and spending more than 20 years, I guess, as an advocate for solar and a developer of solar projects. So I've given a lot of thought to this area, but I think, Tom and Lisa have given a pretty good background about how the interplay works, but so I'm going to use an example, like a little case study for you from the Canadian context. So we have we have 10 provinces that are responsible for their electricity systems. They're little fiefdoms, and they traditionally have guarded those fiefdoms pretty carefully. So much so, in fact, that we have more interconnection between the provinces and the United States than we do between our own provinces. We don't seem to like sharing between our provinces, and I don't know if it's around the economy or just needing to be in control of your assets. But in this big country of Canada, the resources that you can use to create electricity vary greatly. So we would have the provinces of Quebec and Manitoba and British Columbia that sort of spread in different pockets across the country that have they're operated 99% by water power, by hydropower. And so their appetite for using nuclear is non-existent, right? They don't even, I think the default position is to assume they don't need anything else, although they're playing with wind and solar. But then you have these other provinces, and they're coal-fired electricity generation primarily, and some gas, because they don't have water resources at their disposal. So the province of Saskatchewan, like all provinces in Canada, have to phase out their coal by 2030. It's been mandated. And in addition, Canada has a carbon pricing system, which is ratcheting up, $10 a year every year from now until 2030. So the cost, first of all, you have to phase it out, and secondly, the cost of keeping it operating is becoming very risky. So Saskatchewan is looking at what its options are. It has wind and solar, but it can't build more wind and solar because its electricity grid is actually pretty thin and stretched out. There's a joke in Saskatchewan that there's more, hydro poles than people, right? It's a thin population. So getting to the business case, their plan is to bring in 4 or 5 small modular reactors spread out in strategic parts of the province because they're scalable, to bring in water power from the neighboring Manitoba, which has so much hydro. So that sort of breaks down those provincial barriers. And in the process of bringing in hydropower through transmission lines from their neighbor and building out small modular reactors strategically, they actually vastly increase the capacity for variable renewables on the grid. So opening up opportunities for wind and solar to be built. And this pathway, doing it this way, allows them to phase out coal faster. It allows them to avoid building gas plants instead of having coal, and it expands the opportunities for wind and solar, all while saving like 78 megatons of carbon between now and 2030. It's like the poster child of why these technologies need to work together.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. Well, let's turn our conversation a little bit as we've been talking a little bit about electric applications. Let's start talking a bit more about industrial applications for nuclear and how nuclear can really help decarbonize those hard to decarbonize sectors. John, you talked about that a little bit in your opening remarks. Lisa, let me start with you to talk a little bit about deeper decarbonization and using nuclear as a heat source. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Certainly. I mean, we know that nuclear can be a pathway to decarbonization, complementing renewables, especially in the future, and providing that carbon-free baseload power. Certainly, it'll take some dedicated agreements with existing nuclear power plants to ensure industries source more reliable carbon-free power. We've seen recent developments in the U.S. With Bitcoin miners striking agreements that source nuclear power to reduce their operating costs and improve their carbon footprint. If we look ahead, certainly I think nuclear will become a key driver of clean energy beyond providing that through, we've talked about the production of hydrogen and other value-add applications from process heat. If we look at Poland, Synthos, manufacturer of synthetic rubber, one of the biggest producers of chemical raw materials, they're interested in obtaining affordable on-demand carbon-free electricity for their operations. And so, you know, earlier this year, certainly they announced an agreement with ZPAC to look at that. And I think, you know, if we look at that model, right, where we have the Bitcoin miners from the US, and, you know, there's an opportunity for industry to really leverage a carbon-free footprint with nuclear.
Thanks, Lisa. Tom, if you think about the carbon-intensive industries here in the UK, where do you see nuclear fitting in and improving carbon footprint?
Well, look, we have in the UK a rich industrial heritage, and in cities like Glasgow, there's been a lot of energy-intensive activity that's sustained the economy over generations. And you know, some of that has gone, but we've still got, and I think we will still need strategic industries like steel, for example. You know, you need steel not just for building power stations, you need steel for wind turbines, you need steel for pretty much any bit of infrastructure you're going to continue to need. So being able to produce steel is very important, but it's a energy intensive process. And the energy intensive industries in the UK are very committed to trying to find ways to be able to continue to do what they do, because it's very important, economically important as well, but to do that in a way which is compatible with net zero. And that is where there is a really big, I think, challenge that we've only just started to address. Where does nuclear play its part? I think in two ways. Firstly, you know, as we move to a more decarbonised system, then more of our energy will be electricity. So there are things that are happening within some of those industries which are part of a transition to electricity, but there's only any point doing that if the electricity is green. So the electricity demand will be higher. We need to be able to meet that demand, and nuclear can do that because of just the sheer amount of power you get from a facility. But secondly, in terms of other energy sources and other energy uses, we've talked about hydrogen, we've talked about heat. You know, all of those things are ways of being able to get to that secure and reliable supply of energy as well as electricity that those types of industries are going to need. I don't see that there's a way in which we're not going to need those industries. So how do we make those industries compatible with net zero? That, I think, is where nuclear has a very significant role to play.
Do you also see an opportunity for those industries, as they decarbonize faster, to have maybe a competitive advantage as they're looking globally at a market where more and more sustainable products are being required? Are you seeing that as an opportunity as well?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, there's a lot of energy intensive industry in the UK that's very, very aware of that. You know, they're almost impatient to be amongst the first movers because they recognise that dynamic. You know, it's not hard to see. You just be in this city or be anywhere else, you will see any opinion polling you see. There's more and more pressure on this coming from ultimate customers, the public, and the customers in the value chain throughout any system, any production. So, you know, that is something which you know, those industries, I think, are very, very aware of, want to be part of. And I see it as, you know, what is it that nuclear can do for that? Well, nuclear can help those industries get to their solution. We can be part of it. And what is encouraging from my point of view is that the discussions and conversations we've been having with a lot of the energy intensive industries over the past probably year, 18 months has started to really shift in that direction. So I think the recognition is there, the appetite is there. What we've got to do now is to make it happen.
Thanks. John, are you seeing a similar dynamic starting in Canada as well?
Yeah, same dynamic, and Tom is, you know, bang on everything there. And Tom, one of the things that you said, you probably saw me pick up my phone and start typing in. I wasn't being rude. I was trying to chase something down here to one of your points. So you know, we talked about me coming from the renewable side, and there's certainly a lot of tribalism going on in all of these different technologies, right? Some people think that wind and solar are going to be able to solve all of our problems, and that, you know, just combine it with a bit of storage and we're all set. But we all know that we're going to have to clean up our existing electricity grids around the world, and in the case of the case of the United States, let's say, such an important economy, but also a large emitter. You know, that's 60% of, as you would know, Carol, of the electricity in the United States is generated through fossil fuels. They got to clean up that 60% and then double or triple the amount of electricity generation that you have there. In Canada, it's less so, and it varies from place to place. But this challenge is enormous, right? We are going to need absolutely everything we can possibly throw at this this problem. And to Tom's, so that gives you an idea of the scale of things that we have to build out. And Tom was mentioning, the inputs into wind turbines, for example. And I think people have to make this connection, right? So what I was pulling up, Tom, is a single turbine, one turbine, contains 335 tons of steel, 4.7 tons of copper, 3 tons of aluminum, and 700 plus pounds of rare earth minerals, okay, for one wind turbine. So, every energy source has different inputs and different aspects to it, but we're going to have to build out a lot of wind. That means a lot of mining. That's my point. And mining is hard to decarbonize, right? In the Canadian context, these mines are actually off-grid. They're powered by diesel, and they've got huge transportation requirements. Like the size of these machines that move things around wouldn't fit in this room, certainly, right? So the prospect of decarbonizing these hard to decarbonize industries, whether they're the ones that Tom was speaking about, or a mining operation, where you bring in a small modular reactor, you scale it appropriately, it produces the electricity that the operations need, it produces the heat that is required for some of their processes, and it's producing hydrogen to power some of these big machines, right? That's how we're going to decarbonize the type of operations that are inputs to all of the things that we need to do. So that's just really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the segue there is looking at these smaller off-grid locations where you need power. And if you think about that, that's a great way to talk about the variety of technologies in nuclear that are coming to market, from the large scale reactors we have today we're familiar with, down to small modular reactors, and even down to micro reactors that'll have their own applications in different markets and different applications for their energy produced. If we think about that and we think about going global, we've talked a lot about the UK situation, we've talked a lot about the Canadian situation and the North American situation, but there's a big world out there, and there's a lot of opportunity globally for decarbonization, and we're all in this together, so really need to look at how we work globally. Let's start talking a little bit about how countries outside of Europe and outside of North America can start looking at nuclear applications a little differently. Tom, I'd like to start with you a little bit to talk about how you see nuclear playing in the rest of the world outside of the US and Canada and the UK.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that electricity is something which we, in this part of the world, absolutely take for granted, and we have done for a long time. You don't have to travel that far to find places where you either have very, very sketchy electricity supplies and people sort of live their lives in a way where when it comes on, it's almost a bonus, and where there isn't any electricity at all. That doesn't mean for those societies to be able to get the benefits of power that you have to replicate everything we've done in Europe or in the West. You don't have to build a massive grid necessarily. You don't have to go through the process of using fossil fuels to generate your electricity in the first instance, for example. And that's where I think nuclear's got an important part to play. It's thinking about how you best utilise the different technologies that are going to be available with where the need and the requirement is, and not just the need and requirement, actually desire. And there's nothing wrong with people having a desire for power, because I think it's one of the great things, electricity, to be able to improve people's lives, and we shouldn't ever suggest to people that they shouldn't be wanting to improve their lives. And sometimes at the fringes of some of this, you almost get an impression that some people would seem to think, well, we shouldn't be having that, or we shouldn't do that, and I think that's absolutely the wrong way of thinking about it, particularly if you're going to try to get a global, a real global effort, as we're seeing this week in Glasgow and beyond. And it's not just about that electricity for the sake of the electricity. We've talked about some of the other things you can use it for, just thinking about water supplies, for example. the opportunity that nuclear power has to be able to aid the desalination of water, which is again a massive thing that impacts upon quality of life and spread of disease that can be partly tackled as a result of that. You can think further in terms of agriculture and some of the opportunities that come from radioisotopes to be able to then protect crops, for example. All those things have a really important part to play in development across the world that isn't being foisted upon people by the West. It's actually about how you can help countries and nations and areas of the world and communities meet their desires for a higher standard of living, and that's something we can do in a way which is completely compatible with net zero.
Thanks, Tom. Lisa, let me turn to you. As the president of Women in Nuclear Canada, you're part of a global network of women in nuclear organizations. Many of them are in Europe or in North America, but many are also in other parts of the world. Through your experiences, can you share a little bit of a perspective on how you see opportunities for nuclear globally?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Tom certainly touched on a number of things. I think we do need to think about how do we leverage nuclear to improve people's lives beyond clean energy. We certainly know that that's a big part of the value proposition. I think when we look at opportunities for water treatment, for desalination, I think that's something absolutely key that we need to certainly explore further. I think we need to look at how nuclear can support that when we think about access to clean drinking water. And I mean, I talked about this actually at our WIN Global Conference. Some of the challenges that we have in our own Indigenous communities in Canada, in a water-rich nation, where Indigenous communities don't have access to clean drinking water. So I think there's certainly opportunities on a global scale to look at the benefits. And the other thing that I wouldn't overlook is the opportunity from nuclear on district heating, and how do you heat communities, right? There's certainly all of these things, and Tom touched so eloquently on a number of them. I think advanced reactors are going to be able to help a lot of these problems, and we need to think beyond clean electricity. But I think I've always said the value proposition for nuclear goes well beyond clean electricity, but I think those are some of the things that certainly globally are going to be important.
Thanks, Lisa. John, earlier this week, you participated in a panel that talked about nuclear's role in achieving sustainable development goals and seeking a just transition, where really you look at as we phase out fossil energy and high carbon sources, making sure communities aren't left behind. Do you want to share some reflections there?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for diverting it a bit, Carol, because I didn't know how I was going to build on what Don and Lisa said. They covered the territory. But yeah, I mean, in that panel, one of the most exciting conversations that we had, I think, was just about the idea that these crises lead to opportunities to do things completely differently, right? I think we put it in in terms of a just transition, and so that it's not just about creating green electrons or clean electrons, right? I mean, sure, we need to create a lot of clean electrons if we're going to power a future world, but as Tom and Lisa were saying, these grids are going to look different, and the power mix is going to look different, and the build out, especially in these emerging economies or developing nations, have an opportunity to do it in a completely different way than we did. And I agree with Tom wholeheartedly. We can't deprive these emerging economies, developing nations of the right to an abundance of energy, right? And so small modular reactors is going to have a very important role to play in those different areas. And one of the things that has excited me and made me very proud about joining the nuclear sector is the way that nuclear can contribute to a sustainable future, a just future, in ways that no other technology can. I mean, I loved the aspects of solar that, you know, reached out to the countries of Africa, for example, where they suffer from electricity poverty, and it's impacting the ability of their children to learn. It's impacting the ability of women to, you know, free themselves from things, and you know, solar panels are playing an important role there. But small modular reactors and nuclear, conventional nuclear, you know, writ large, brings so much more. It hits on every single one of those sustainable development goals that the United Nations has laid out, right? The 17 sustainable development goals for a just future that's good for everybody. And Tom hit on some of those. It's not only the electricity that we create, but it's the desalination of water. It's nuclear medicine and isotopes. It's the irradiation of grains and things like that, as Tom was saying, to make them last longer and things like that. You go down the list of the 17, and nuclear delivers on every single one of those and can help nations in that respect. And that should give everybody in our industry a lot of pride, and I think a lot of hope for those nations.
Thanks, John. Well, I think we're coming towards the end of our first session together, so I want to thank our panel here, Lisa, Tom, and John, and we're going to take a 10-minute break and be right back with you. Thank you. Welcome back to Nuclear for a Net Zero Century. I'm Carol Berrigan with the Nuclear Energy Institute, and I'm joined by John Gorman from the Canadian Nuclear Association, Tom Greatrex from the UK Nuclear Industry Association, and Lisa McBride from Women in Nuclear Canada and GE Hitachi. So we had a good conversation in the first segment of this program where we talked about the applications of nuclear energy to helping decarbonize our energy sector and hard to decarbonize industries. Now we'll talk about some of the financing that's necessary to move ahead. The financial community, both investors and institutions, are increasingly looking increasingly considering sustainability in their finance. We're going to talk a little bit about how nuclear fits there, as well as how financing will be necessary to achieve some of the ambitious decarbonization goals that we've set for ourselves. So let me start with a question for you, Tom. How do we mobilize private sector capital around innovative nuclear? What is the experience in the UK, and how do you look to finance nuclear investments here?
Well, it's a very interesting time to be talking about this in relation to the UK, because just last week legislation was introduced, so it started its process in the UK Parliament to institute a new funding mechanism for nuclear, because our experience over the past few years has been that it's been very challenging to be able to get the projects off the ground. There's not a challenge in terms of the technology. There's not a challenge in terms even of acceptability or community enthusiasm for projects. Indeed, when one of the projects that was going to happen didn't happen, it was very hard to find anybody who was supportive of that decision. So, but it's been a challenge in relation to financing the projects. If you're building a power station that is going to produce equivalent of current electricity demand of 6 or 7% of the nation's energy demand, that's going to do it for probably at least 60, but probably more like 80, 90 years. It's going to produce a lot of electricity, where almost all of the money you need is at the front end. And because of the way that the decommissioning is funded as well, that means that the capital intensity of those projects is very, very significant. And the model that we had in the UK, or we have been using in the UK, a contract for difference model, where the developer bears all the risk, and then it's only at the point of generating electricity that there's any return, and there's an underwritten price, has proved to be an expensive way of doing it. More expensive than it needs to be, and it's born, I think, of a combination of an orthodoxy about private investment in infrastructure, which is typical to the UK, which is starting to be re-examined, and also of not really taking into account the requirements of a lot of the big infrastructure investors that are out there. Because now what we're moving to is a system called regulated asset base, which effectively means that as parcels of work are done on a project, revenue is released. That means if you're a pension fund or a big institutional investor who wants a steady steady sort of low risk, predictable return model, that's very attractive. It's something that's used in other infrastructure, hasn't been used in nuclear before, and that does three things. Firstly, it opens up that pool of investors, so that you're encouraging more private capital to come in, because they understand the requirement for the endpoint. They understand that it fits wider policy goals and societal goals in terms of clean energy. And they understand as well that this is a technology and engineering that works and is going to be really important for the future. Secondly, it significantly reduces the cost of capital, and that has an impact on what consumers and taxpayers will eventually pay in the cost of delivering the infrastructure. And so it doesn't really matter if in comparison to using a CFD type model, if there's some, if there are some problems encountered, the cost to consumer is always going to be less. That has a third element, I think, which is that it also underpins the understanding that you need a lot of different sources, and that one isn't just, inverted commas, too expensive. Because it's not the technology that's too expensive, it's not the electricity that comes at the end that is too expensive. What's expensive is the cost of capital. That is then a feature of and a characteristic of using a particular financing mechanism. So, having almost exhausted through projects which have spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and got a lot of enthusiasm going, and had supply chains getting interested and excited and putting investment in, and then those projects not happening. We've experienced that in the UK over the past few years. I think finally we're moving to a model which makes the ability to be able to get these projects going much more straightforward. It means that the cost to the consumer is much lower, and it also means that the amount of opportunity for private sector investment is much higher as well.
Thanks, Tom. John, how do you see this in Canada? You have ambitious plans for SMRs and advanced reactors. Can you talk a little bit about how that will move forward?
Yes, yeah. And before I do, Carol, I just want to say I think Tom sort of captured many of the moving pieces around conventional nuclear and what's happening there, and there are other moving pieces too, right? Where we see what's happening with gas prices now, which is impacting dynamics. I'm sure you're seeing that in the United States, Carol. There's the incredible drop in prices of variable renewables and things like that. There's new models that new models, financing models, and ways of incorporating electricity onto the grid that utilities and investors are looking at now, which have fundamentally changed the way that we finance traditional electricity sources. And so nuclear is in a bit of a crossroads now, where it's suffering from being an antiquated financing model with those centralized plants in a world where not only has the grid changed, but the financing models have changed. And so what Tom is describing, I think, is the way of conventional nuclear catching up. When it comes to small modular reactors, I guess I'd say and Lisa will surely have a comment on this from the GE perspective, but it's hard to find private financing for small modular reactors because it's a new technology. I mean, the truth is these technologies have actually been under development for a long time. They're based on 60 years of experience operating nuclear assets. The financing industry should have a lot of confidence in the nuclear industry and where it's going with these advanced reactors. But in reality, and we saw this with solar, in the early days, there's a huge education process that the financing community and the banking community has to go through. I mean, it's one of these things that our industry has to actively work to develop that pathway with financiers as we develop all of the other pathways we're developing to develop and deploy these small modular reactors. So I guess my first point, Carol, is in the Canadian context, and I think elsewhere, the financing community just doesn't understand the technology. They don't understand how it's going to fit in. They don't see the proven business case because these things are just being piloted. There's not a lot of clients out there. I mean, they're pretty few and far between that are saying we're going to build one and be the offtake for it and things like that. So a big issue. And I think an indication, this is just a little anecdote, but I had a very interesting meeting here in COP. There's been so many, but one with a group called Breakthrough Energy. I don't know if I'm supposed to be mentioning any particular groups here, but Breakthrough Energy is, I think, one of the Bill Gates spin-offs. And as we all know, Bill Gates is developing TerraPower, a small modular reactor, a molten salt reactor. But this Breakthrough Energy group, it's a financing group, is not really geared towards small modular reactors only. It's geared towards the whole suite of technologies that are under development right now. So hydrogen, which we were speaking about earlier, carbon capture and storage, smart grid, various types of energy storage, and small modular reactors. And I just mentioned this in the context of financing because it's taking an organization as innovative as the Gates structure of companies to set up a company that is going to actively pool together billions of dollars and begin strategically investing in these technologies that are not proven yet, but they know are going to be needed for our net zero future. So it's a leap of faith, I think, for all of these technologies right now, and we've got a long way to go in terms of proving out the potential and the case for all of these technologies, including small modular reactors. But they're absolutely going to be needed. So I'm glad to see that the financing community is beginning to get behind it.
Thanks, John. Lisa, let me turn to you. One of the things that we're hearing more and more about from the financial community is this concept of ESG and sustainability. What would you want this community to know about nuclear energy as you see nuclear meeting these sustainability goals?
Well, I mean, certainly it is a sustainable energy source. I think it's, if we think kind of what it means from an environmental perspective, right? I'm starting my second week here at COP, but I'm sure this has been said a million times or more, but we won't get to net zero without nuclear, full stop. And so if we think about what that means for the future, if I think from a government perspective, I think we really need to think about how do we enable the opportunity for nuclear to have a seat at the table to complement renewables and other electricity sources. So I think, that would be my starting point in terms of nuclear and sustainability and ESG.
Speaking about finance and net zero needs nuclear, who else said that recently at COP here? Is Mark Carney, right, who's just introduced, it was the UN Finance and Climate Advisor. He just launched this multi-trillion-dollar approach between financing institutions and banks here at COP to change the way that investors are looking at making their investments. And as he said, right, Tom, he's not seen a credible path to net zero without nuclear. So yeah, I think it's going to be an important part of the mix.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to what John and Tom so eloquently said. When we think about this, it's we need a diversified set of stakeholders to enable the path for nuclear. And I think we've seen in the U.S., right, tax credits, production tax credits as well. We need that for nuclear. We need to level the playing field on what we bring to the table. I think that would certainly be something that would help investors see nuclear as a good investment.
I think it's a really important point, actually, the way in which financial institutions that haven't necessarily had very much to do with nuclear in the past, and when you think about the way in which nuclear has been done, not completely, but largely, the state has been a heavy actor in it. Therefore, private capital hasn't necessarily been involved as much, particularly when you think about the time when our current fleet in the UK, for example, when it was built, was all done by the Central Electricity Generating Board. It's effectively part of the state planning. We don't have that same structure anymore. And I've certainly found that talking to people in the investment community, that there's a lot of people who aren't that aware of nuclear and what it does and how it does it. It's part of the same dynamic about some of the conversation with the general public as well. And because they haven't had that same level of exposure, I think there's probably a bit of a higher bar to be able to develop that understanding. But what's positive about John mentioned Mark Carney's initiative and others that have been around this week in Glasgow and are happening is that the development of that sort of ESG agenda and people that are looking at that properly are that the things you need to do to get to an environmental and sustainable future. There are anything that you do, there are costs as well as benefits, and you've got to how you properly measure those to be able to get a point, to be able to make an assessment whether something meets that criteria or not. It's something that isn't just about nuclear. Actually, it's much wider than that. But that I think the challenge we still have to overcome amongst some is to get an understanding that nuclear shouldn't be thought of as differently from all those other things. And there has been a great, I think, tendency for nuclear to be exclusive, and some of that is probably our own fault as a sector and as an industry and where we've come from. But that isn't compatible with where we need to be for the future, and so that whole ESG debate is really, really important, I think.
Carol, can I jump in here too? Just so
Sure.
you're not going to get a chance to.
Sure.
Everybody else jumped in. But I just want to build on that, but especially something that Lisa said earlier, which is about we got to be more clear about the cost of nuclear electricity and the way people see things. So, wind and solar have spent the last 2 decades or so gaining confidence from the financial community in terms of what their generation source could do on electricity grids. And it was a tough slog, right? They had to get new policies and regulations that allowed their electricity, their intermittent electrons to come onto the grid. They had to educate local distribution companies and utilities about why they should want to bring in this disruptive technology, and they had to educate the finance community. But what's driving me to distraction now as a former renewables person is these same people who went through that challenge, the advocates for wind and solar, who have brought down the cost per kilowatt of solar from $70 down to whatever it is now, 40 cents per kilowatt, for example. These same people saying that nuclear small modular reactors in this case are too expensive. I mean, 15 years ago, solar was an expensive science experiment, and thank goodness today we have all of the financial backing. We've seen solar be rolled out in huge quantities, and it will continue to play a very, very important role. But if we hadn't gone through that cycle and brought the costs down through mass production of these things, and by educating everyone from financiers to the utilities, we wouldn't have that at our disposal, right? So to hear wind or solar advocates saying, these technologies are too expensive, they're in the future, we have to invest everything in wind and solar, is a bit, I don't know, it's just a bit duplicitous or something like that, right? So yeah, we've got a big challenge ahead of us in terms of educating people. But to Lisa's point, and this is my last part of my interjection here before I interject again, my last point is how we look at cost is important. I mean, sure, wind and solar, maybe between whatever it is, $40 and $50 a megawatt hour now. But what are we getting for that $40 to $50 per megawatt hour? You're getting electrons on a sort of a variable basis, right? When we want to increase, and we do need to increase the level of intermittent electricity that we have, as soon as you start increasing the penetration, you have to start modifying the grid. You have to start adding storage, or you have to start pairing additional base loads so that you can actually allow increased amounts of intermittent renewables. So you're not really comparing apples to apples when you talk about just electrons. Small modular reactors and nuclear generally, is providing 24/7 clean electricity, flexible and very responsive, able to to help partner with these renewables. So we should really be looking at the cost of an electron from a small modular reactor in comparison to storage plus grid modification plus wind turbines or solar panels, and whatever else you need to do to accommodate those things. So let's get away from the technology tribalism here and start talking very seriously about apples to apples comparisons and how these things work together. So I think that's going to be a financing challenge as well.
Thanks, John. Let me turn back to that apples to apples comparison and that issue, and turn to an issue that's been in the news quite a bit over the past year and a half, which is the EU taxonomy. Looking at how the taxonomy has been developed, Tom, can you share some insights on where you see the conversation around the EU taxonomy or a UK taxonomy, and how nuclear will play in something like that, and the advantages in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a taxonomy, or taxonomies as they're developed, are really important signals to the investment community and more widely, frankly, about the way in which different technologies or different parts of the solution to addressing climate change can be done, and what is applicable. So they're not something we should sort of ignore as being irrelevant or not important. I mean, my experience of the EU one is it's been quite interesting, because when the process of it started, the UK was part of the EU. The UK is now outside of the EU, famously, but will still be impacted by the EU taxonomy. And we've had the really, I think, fascinating to watch from a sort of semi-detached perspective, the clash between the science and the politics. Because what you've had is when they've been, commissioned experts without any sort of prejudice towards any particular technology to make an assessment in terms of nuclear as part of that taxonomy discussion. The result, which isn't to be a surprise to any of us on this panel, was that yes, nuclear fits with being able to get to a decarbonised, sustainable future. So it should be one of the options. It's not mandated for anybody. It's just one of the options that member states might choose or not choose to use. Then you get the interventions of parts of the elected European Parliament, come from all the different member states of the EU, amongst some of the members of the Council of Ministers from different parts of the EU, basically trying to say, well, no, we don't want nuclear, so it shouldn't be included. By the way, if you're Belgium, with a partly Green Party government, we don't want nuclear, but actually we want gas to be counted as low carbon, because that's what we're going to need to do to fill the gap from closing our nuclear early. And you get all of the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of politics muddying what should be an objective, science-based, science-led objective process, because what a taxonomy should be giving you is the range of options. The political decisions will always be political, and there'll be some member states in the EU that want to do nuclear and some that don't want to do nuclear, and that's for those states to make that call. But what we shouldn't have is this sort of noisy attempt to impose restrictions on how we get to decarbonisation. And I'll give you the most pressing example I think I've seen, or most ridiculous. At one level it was funny, but actually when you think about it, it should be something that make you a bit angry really. Example of this is that it was a couple of weeks ago, the Austrian representative at a EU discussion on some of these things was saying, well actually look, in Austria we don't want to have nuclear power. Fair enough, that's the Austrians' decision, and that's a decision for their government and effect with their citizens. We don't want it. So the countries that don't have nuclear, states that don't want to do nuclear, we should be able to have a lesser set of standards to try to meet in terms of decarbonisation targets. But when you think about the hypocrisy of that statement, which is effectively saying what we've all said, you need nuclear to be able to get to net zero, but then if you choose not to do it, you shouldn't be held to the same standards as everybody else, just underlines the ridiculousn's of the politics in that process. So moving to the UK taxonomy, the UK is developing its own taxonomy. I'm hoping, and we're talking to the people involved in that quite a lot, that they learn from the mess of the EU taxonomy's development to make it and to keep it an objective process and an objective set of assessments. Because I think where we're going to end up in the EU, what looks most likely at the moment, is that nuclear will be included, but so will gas. So therefore, you sort of think, well, what's the point? If this is what it's supposed to be about, is about setting a standard that people need to meet to be able to, the options to be able to make decarbonisation happen. And so, in the UK context, we're trying to avoid those mistakes. And I think the wider lesson on this is that, politics is full of inconsistency, hypocrisy, double standards and everything else. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, you find that. This is so important. We have to have the objective science-based underpinning for the decisions then to be made against.
That's pretty strong coming from a former policymaker and member of parliament. Right? Was it liberating to say that?
Lisa, you wanted to add?
I was just going to add to that. I think Tom said it well. I think certainly there's a role to play, but only if we're honest about what each electricity generation type brings to the table. Again, it really comes down to leveling the playing field. And so, nuclear is the only carbon-free baseload electricity. And so we're fooling ourselves if we don't consider it an equal part of the conversation.
Thank you. Well, I want to shift the conversation a little bit. We've been talking a little bit about taxonomies and investments, but I want to talk a little bit and pick up on a thread of something that John had talked about earlier in terms of moving new nuclear technologies from the drawing board and into reality. as we start looking at these technologies, where do you see the role of government in moving technologies forward? John, do you want to start talking about that a little bit?
Sure. And this is in the Canadian context around government funding for small modular reactors, a very active discussion and debate. So let me say, first of all, based on our earlier conversation, it's clear that we're at a gap right now that has to be closed between developing emerging technologies versus proven technologies, right? And it's in this, I don't know if they call that the dead zone or whatever it is, but it's many of these technologies and some small modular reactor technologies are still in that financing dead zone of sort of being a proven technology but not demonstrated type thing, right? And I think this is clearly an area where government funding is helpful because it provides a piece of what they need and a real legitimizer for private finance and investors to come in and couple with that government funding. So I think that's very important. In the context of Canada, we're fortunate in that we have 4 different provinces, 4 of the 10 provinces that have signed a memorandum of understanding, the premiers, the leaders of each of those provinces, saying, look, here's our situation with the resources that we have. We have to phase out coal, and because of our industry intense or natural resource intense economies, we really need small modular reactors. So our plan is to develop and deploy small modular reactors, and we're willing to support that if the federal government also step in. At the same time, 4 utilities in Canada, the major utilities, are essentially crown corporations owned by the provinces, have entered into a joint business venture to develop and deploy small modular reactors in 3 different streams. And 2 of those major utilities have already committed to connecting small modular reactors at various sites in their provinces. So we have this perfect support structure and plan in place right now for the development and deployment of small modular reactors in different streams. And while we have seen the beginning of government funding, federal government funding for select technologies, there is an integrated plan and an integrated ask in front of the federal government that it is seriously considering right now, but I would say is absolutely vital to triggering the private investment and the future deployment of small modular reactors. So it's vital.
Thanks, John. I know in the U.S. we have a strong role for our federal government in terms of investment with industry in demonstrating these new technologies.
Right.
Through the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, there are 2 reactors that will be built by 2028, I think, 2027, 2028, as a cost share between the reactor developer and the federal government. And that is definitely building momentum in the U.S. to get across that valley of death that you were talking about, moving from concept into demonstration. So let me turn back to let me turn to Tom then and see from the UK standpoint, how are you seeing the UK government engaging to get technologies moved forward? And what are the opportunities there?
Yeah, I mean, there is, just building on what John was saying, talking about SMR specifically, I can't say it now, but people keep their eyes open the next day, maybe 2 days, with the outcome of some work that the Rolls-Royce SMR consortium have been doing in terms of fundraising, which is probably at that stage that John was just talking about. It's match funding, but my understanding is there'll be significant of that coming from the private sector investment because they can see the benefit of what the output of that technology is and the need for that technology to be developed and advanced. And that's something which I think will be the first time that I think in nuclear in the UK where you've seen that amount of or that scale of investment coming in from private. So that's just one, but that's something that's relatively close to market. I think where you go back to things that are in development, advanced. Well, in the UK we have a sort of a distinction in when policymakers talk between smaller modular reactors and advanced modular reactors. And in the so use the lexicon in the AMR bracket, there's a whole range of really very interesting potential technologies that are a relatively early stage of development. Now, some of those have been able to attract private sector investment, but they need to have, I think, as they're getting, proving their proof of concept, there needs to be engagement from policy makers as well. Not least because one of the things that you're going to need if you're going to ever get to deployment is a sense that there is a strong sense of the requirement for it. And one of the biggest things the government can do is not necessarily directly financial, is actually setting a very clear statement or set of statements and intent with a bit of detail built below it that this, yes, we are going to need this in the UK, that then enables people to come into the playing field. And the second thing that government needs to be able to, I think, do that's useful in this context is an understanding then that then to deliver it, it's not just about a technology, a reactor technology being developed and being licensed and being ready, then it's about, well, how do you then maximise the economic opportunity from the deployment of that? How you do that with the supply chain? How do you make sure you've got people with the right level of skills to be able to then make those things happen? Because all the things that often get left too late, think about that towards the start. That has a really beneficial impact. And the third thing I think is that the governments generally can do is ally wider policy goals to supporting the development of technology. And this is true in nuclear, it's true in fusion as well as in fission, it's true actually across other emerging technologies in the energy space, which is being able to ally that with the wider policy objectives, both in terms of economic policy, environmental policy, and international policy as well. And I think if governments can get their head around doing those sort of three suite of things together, that will really help the, people that have got emerging technologies to develop them and get them to deployment. And it should be seen as effectively a partnership between government and industry. And to start with, probably, government might feel like they're taking more of a burden, but as you go through those stages, that becomes less and less significant, and that then gives us, I think, the best way forward.
One of the things that you're talking about is almost a government signaling to industry that these technologies are necessary and needed. Lisa, if I can turn to you, as government provides these signals, how do you see the private sector responding? What has been your experience?
Well, I think that would certainly be a strong signal to the private sector, right? So if we're investing from a government perspective in innovation and in the full suite of things that require investment, as Tom mentioned, right? That, the skills development, the jobs, all of those things, good signal for investors, right? And if we think about some of the earlier comments about kind of some of that support for tax credit for renewables, if we coupled that for the nuclear industry, certainly I think we would see some strong support from an investor perspective. But I think we definitely need to see that signal on innovation and clean energy for the future from nuclear power.
And I want to build on that a little bit. You're part of a global business and you're engaging in many, many markets around the world. Are you seeing strong signals outside of the markets we've been talking about, principally of the UK, the US, and Canada? Are you seeing other strong signals where you think, yes, this is showing us the path forward?
Yeah. Well, I think earlier I mentioned, what we saw in Poland with Synthos Green Energy, right? They want to build SMRs at coal-fired plants. So I think, certainly we are seeing it outside of those markets. And I think, if I think from a US, Canada, UK perspective, if we continue to build on what we have in these three countries, we will continue to see market opportunities around the world.
Can I add to the
Sure.
signal, because Lisa's talked about signals and Tom was talking about the importance of policy makers, leaders saying, yes, we need this, right? And these things are vitally important, but there's another type of signal which is more basic, and that is recognition that we're going to need a lot more electricity. And in Canada, we have, as I said, these provinces, and each of them controls their own electricity generation mix and their own grid. All of them have independent electricity systems operators, right, which are in theory independent and for the most part are. But these system operators are not telegraphing, forecasting the need for more electricity generation, by and large. You know, they're saying generation or demand is going to be flat. Well, demand is not going to be flat. We need to, you know, clean up the last part of the emitting part of our grid, and then we've got to double or triple. In Canada, it's triple the amount of generation we have by 2050. I don't care what you want to build, whether it's a wind farm or a new conventional reactor or small modular reactors. We have to start building those things like right now. And we need the provincial leaders, we need the federal leaders to be signaling to their states or provinces that we need to double or triple the amount of electricity we have. We need the state level or the provinces to be backing that up and telling their systems operators to make a plan. And we have to see what that generation plan and demand is going to be so that we can start planning and building and get the dollars that are going to fuel that. And if we don't do that, then we're just going to be building up a deficit every single year. And soon we're going to find ourselves up against a wall where we don't have enough time to build out the amount of electricity that we need. So there's another signal, and that is, you know, let's get building now.
That's a tremendous amount of investment you're talking about happening almost immediately. A lot of the conversation at COP has been talking about decarbonizing different sectors, looking at decarbonizing the transportation sector with things like electric vehicles. Tom, I think you spoke a little bit earlier in our first session about how it's important that the electricity for those applications be clean. That's just a huge potential signal for clean energy investment. We are coming towards the end of our time together, and I want to give each of you a couple of minutes just to sort of summarize and crystallize your thoughts around investment in nuclear and investment in clean energy and nuclear, and what would you give our audience as some parting thoughts? Tom, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Look, I think fundamentals, we've said it all a number of times through the course of both these sessions. Net zero needs nuclear. That's about the wider context, all of the things that are harder to decarbonise. And so the investment community and investors should be confident in the benefits they will accrue from investing in nuclear. That's the first point. Second point is the requirement for, I think, industry, and not just industry, but, you know, civic society and those that have the expertise to help some parts of the finance community understand what nuclear is and, importantly, what it isn't. And without being too pejorative about it, there are people in the investment community and the finance community who are very, very sure of themselves. But that confidence doesn't always necessarily rest on a complete understanding of what they're talking about. So we need to help them with that. That's something which I think is a challenge for industry and more widely to be able to help to address that. And the third and final thing I think I would say on this is, look, the scale of meeting that net zero challenge is immense. You know, I think it's really sometimes quite hard to remind yourselves just about how immense that is and how short a period of time we've got to do it. So this is the sort of thing that needs all of those levers being pulled in the right direction. That's not just about nuclear, that's about a whole range of different things we need to do to get to net zero. But for the nuclear part of it, the financing is absolutely critical. It's the financing mechanisms that enable the things to get done, not being tied to a previous orthodoxy about how we used to do things. We are in, as we've said, and has been said in this city over the last few days and will be over the next few, a climate emergency. If you're in an emergency, then you use your brains, you find ways of being able to do things that might be different from how they've been done in the past. Don't be wedded to them. Look at what the objective is. Let's go and do it.
Thanks, Tom. Lisa, a couple of thoughts?
Well, I like Tom's thoughts. I would say, you know, I'm going to repeat it. Net zero needs nuclear, right? Climate change is the biggest crisis we are facing today. We need the government to support a pathway to nuclear as part of the solution that opens up opportunities for investments. And, you know, the other thing that we haven't really touched on, nuclear already provides 10% of clean electricity around the world, globally, 10% globally today. And so we need to build on that. We think about, you know, the fuel pellet, one fuel pellet removes 564 liters, I think, of oil. So, you know, if we think about kind of the opportunity, it's energy dense, the opportunity for clean electricity in the future, we need to pull it all together. And as John said earlier, we need to do that now.
Thanks, Lisa. John?
Okay. So, well, Tom and Lisa have said everything very well, but I guess if I'm going to connect it to finance, then I would just reiterate that financial opportunity. We know from all of the experts around the world, including the International Energy Agency, that the single most important, most effective thing that any nation can do to decarbonize is to fuel switch and electrify as many of the sectors as they can with clean electricity. And we have to do this by 2050, right, to create a net zero future. Clean it up, triple the size of it. If that isn't an investment opportunity in the waiting, I don't know what is, right? The second thing I'd say, Carol, is just echoing Tom's comment about the size of the challenge here. It is going to take every single clean energy technology that we have at our disposal and everything that we can develop and deploy between now and 2050. The challenge is enormous, and I'll just put this into context. 20 years ago, when I started in solar, because I was concerned about, you know, emissions and wanted to marry what I was doing with that concern, we had 36% non-emitting electricity on the world's electricity grids. 36% non-emitting. So today, more than 20 years later, after the astounding drop in prices of wind and solar, after trillions of dollars of investment, after favorable policies and an educated finance community and utilities, after the huge rollout of renewables, thankfully, we're still at 36% non-emitting electricity on the world's grids. Okay, we don't have 20 years to stay at a even keel, you know, just thanks to renewables being there. And we probably wouldn't have been able to stay there if it weren't for the rollout of renewables. We got to clean up the rest of that coal and gas from the world's grids, and we've got to triple the amount of electricity that we have. And nuclear is going to be an absolutely indispensable part of that, that mix, and net zero needs nuclear.
Thanks, John. Well, that concludes our segment here at Nuclear for a Net Zero Century. Again, thank you to our hosts for today, Energy UK, Renewable UK, and the UK Nuclear Industries Association. We hope that you enjoyed this segment and that you learned, as I did, from our wonderful guests. Have a great day.
Thanks, Carol.